it's Courtney and welcome back to my first book review of 2021. I am really excited today to be talking about Crossings by Alex Landragin. Crossings came out in 2020, so it is a fairly new release. I read it back in November before the holiday season and my subsequent media break took place. So it's been a little bit, but I'm really excited to dive back into this story. So Crossings is a book about a book, more specifically a manuscript where anybody who reads it dies a violent and mysterious death. And from the very beginning, the reader is really immersed into this story. The beginning preface is actually written from the perspective of the current owner and publisher of Crossings, and the book itself is the actual manuscript to which he refers. The really interesting thing, and the thing that I loved the most about Crossings, is that it can be read in two different ways. One is your traditional cover to cover, in which you will encounter and read 3 semi-related stories, or you can read what is called the Baroness sequence. You jump in and out of the 3 different manuscripts. Usually it's like a chapter at a time, and you uncover the story that way through kind of this literary puzzle. I personally chose to read the Baroness sequence, mostly because, like I said, it reminded me of a Choose Your Own Adventure, which is a little bit of like nostalgia back to 5th grade when I was obsessed with Choose Your Own Adventure books. I am very thankful though that I did, because I think that really increased my enjoyment of this novel as a whole. I am not a huge historical fiction reader. Crossings was actually a little bit out of some of my typical genres, but because it has some sort of fantastical elements and because of the whole concept of a Baroness sequence, I decided to give it a try. The 3 stories themselves, which are The Education of a Monster, City of Ghost, and Tales of the Albatross, were not overly interesting to me just by themselves. However, the way in which Landragin weaves them all together to paint this larger narrative was super interesting. The stories themselves span 3 separate centuries, the first taking place in the 18th century, and then the most recent taking place in the 20th century, specifically World War II. All 3 stories loosely center or have a connection to the very real French poet Charles Baudelaire. The first, Education of a Monster, is actually supposed to be a long lost manuscript of his, and then he plays a role in the other stories as well. There are also, throughout some of the stories, there are also some really fun Easter egg type references to real historical figures. Specifically, Coco Chanel plays a part. These appearances were mostly surface level to me. I didn't find that Coco's character made a huge difference in the story. It was more just added a quirky, fun element to it. But it was interesting to read this story and have it very grounded in reality, especially with the way that the author sets up the premise with the preface and making you seem like you are actually encountering the story, making it seem like you've stumbled upon a found manuscript and really immersing you in that story. I actually went into this novel expecting it to be a lot more challenging than it was. I found that once I got into it, it moved fairly quickly. I was worried, based on some of the reviews and the publisher's description, that this would be very literary and therefore a little alienating. But I actually think it's pretty accessible to anybody who is interested in magical realism or historical fiction. I will say that I think that this ease of reading did come from the fact that I chose to read the Baroness's sequence. The last manuscript, the Tales of the Albatross, is very long and very dense. In fact, it takes up almost 50% of the book. But the Tales of the Albatross is where you definitely get the most detail and the most background, so it spans the longest period of time. But the thing that really got me is that the chapters are very long, and I'm somebody who really struggles with long chapters because I use chapter and breaks as a mental break for me while reading, but also as like a way to celebrate progress. So I sometimes struggle getting through chapters that are longer than 10, 15, 20 pages, especially when all of the chapters are around 30 or 40 pages in length. The Baroness sequence, being able to jump in and out of those longer chapters and have a break with some shorter, more plot-based moments was a huge plus for me. Had I read in a traditional way and had to read Tales of the Albatross front to back, there's a pretty decent chance that I actually probably wouldn't have finished this book. But the first two stories are much shorter and way more plot-based, and therefore move a lot at a much faster pace. So it was nice to be able to read from those two and then read Tales of the Albatross and then jump back to those other two, which is basically the structure it goes. It kind of, you read a chapter from each story at a time. Occasionally you'll read two sequential chapters from the same story, but I think that only happens a couple times. Don't take my projected struggles as a negative thing. I actually think that that's a huge positive endorsement of this book, because it shows how important the different sequences are to your experience as a reader. And me being able to say like, hey, if I would have just read this as a traditional book, I wouldn't have. But because I chose to read it in the Baroness sequence, I actually ended up really loving and enjoying it, is a huge plus. So there are lots of people out there who read this in the traditional way. I'm sure those people have a lot more patience than me and are probably more immersed in historical fiction as a genre. So there's nothing wrong with doing it that way. But if you're like me and a little hesitant, I would definitely recommend reading the Baroness sequence, just because I do think it regulates the story and the pacing in a way that makes it more enjoyable. As for like the plot and the story, it's really hard to talk about that in much detail, because the way in which you read the novel affects the timing in which you learn specific things. So like I said, Tales of the Albatross, the last story, is definitely where you begin to start to understand what's happening. But for somebody reading in the traditional way, like that, you won't get to that till the end. So it's a very different experience, where instead of trying to piece together things while you go, it's more trying to fill in gaps afterwards. I will say that overall the story does deal with the concept of a soul, specifically the transmigration of souls, which is souls moving in and out of different bodies. A body may die, but a soul can achieve immortality. It does specifically deal with 3 intertwined souls. And within the stories of those 3 intertwined souls, you do see a very traditional story there between the lovers and then the villain. So this is not a romance. I've seen some descriptions of this as a romance. It does have a very quiet love story, and I think that you probably will get more of that with the Baroness sequence. So if that's kind of what you're here for, then I would definitely once again recommend reading in the Baroness sequence. However, if you're coming to this book wanting a romance and coming to this book specifically for the romance, you will probably find yourself a bit let down. It never reaches this like big climactic ending, whether that be via tragedy or via the happy ending. Instead, it just kind of fades out into a very open ending that continues the idea and the theme of continuity and eternity. All in all, I'm giving Crossings a 4 out of 5 stars. It's beautifully written, and even though this is not my typical type of read, the puzzle of the plot was enough to really keep me excited and engaged. As I was reading it, the one book that I kept coming back to is The Clockmaker's Daughter by Kate Morton. It is very similar in kind of both theme and ideas, and then also just the way that it's written. So if you liked The Clockmaker's Daughter, this will honestly probably be a really great read for you. If you've read Crossings, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. I'll be back with a reading update on Monday. In the meantime, like, comment, subscribe to the channel, and follow me on Instagram at NotSoWellRead. Bye, everyone.